joy in this world, accustomed to aspiring no longer to appear. I'm using this as my entry line for this talk because it explains part of my experience in life. And as I've connected with and had conversations with so many African people around the continent and the diaspora, I realized that this also describes the experience of many other Africans. Black Man Know Yourself. I've chosen this title. It's lifted from one of the tracks on Femi Kuti album that was released about 20 years ago, called Shoki Shoki. And in this song, he motivates the African man to denounce the effects of colonialism, of the culture that has been taken away from Africa in many ways, or denounced and ridiculed, and for African men to stand up and own their journey and their identity. And this talk is inspired by that song. Knowledge of self, we could say that self-knowledge is the beginning of all knowledges. It's the platform that you stand on, is the ability to be. Without it, from an African point of view, you will be unable to really form a purpose and to hold yourself in terms of self-determination, in terms of who you are supposed to be as an African man or as an African woman. This is a sensitive subject, and I need to make a disclaimer. When I say, for instance, or I refer to certain challenges that African men endure, it is not in opposition, or it's not to the neglect, or it's not to undermine the many, many atrocities and experiences that are endured by African women. It's also not a competition about who's got it worse. I think it's more a realization that we all have problems, and this talk wants to address some of the issues that African men face. It is also not a pity party. This is not about feeling sorry for ourselves. This is not about African men just pleading with weakness. This is about taking responsibility. And it is also not to paint all black men with the same brush and say that we all have exactly the same experience. I think we have many common denominators, but we are aware of the diversity of experiences of African men, and it's not to the neglect of that. So who is the African man? I think if we were able to go deeply into history, we see that the African man appears in this world as somebody of responsibility, of somebody who is a builder, a healer, a great contributor to his society, his family, and his nation. If we go a few steps further in history, we see how enslavement, how colonialism, and the many atrocities that has been done by people who invaded this continent, how it has also affected the African man to such an extent that it seems like we remember the African man more for what he is not. So the African man is not seen as a good provider, not as a good politician, not as a good knowledge holder, not as a good community person. We remember a whole lot of negative images. And it's important to question that, especially in a time when we hear voices saying that all black men are trash, all black men are useless. It's important to question where that comes from and whether that is, in fact, true. This reminds me of a conversation I had with young men 20 years ago. I was living in Norway at the time, and we had an organization called African Youth in Norway. And we wanted to have a youth camp. So we had one youth camp for the young men and one for the young women. And in both camps, we asked, who is your role model? Who do you aspire to, who do you draw inspiration from? And almost exclusively in the young women's camp, they chose mothers, aunties, women that they have met, women that they can go and visit, women who are in their lives. And almost exclusively in the young men's camp, they chose men that they have never met, men that they probably will never meet, men that they know through TV, through music, through sports. And it made me ask, is it so that many of us as African men struggle to find role models, or struggle to look up to other African men? And as I'm saying this, I would like for you in your own mind to just reflect. How many men that you have access to would you describe as great role models for you? I hope you come up with a big number, but from the work that I've done, I wouldn't be so surprised if some of you struggle to come up with many numbers, because it seems like we are not really dwelling so much on the contributions that African men have made. This is interesting to me as it has become part of my journey. I work with men, women, children, youth, elders. But part of my work is solely dedicated to understanding African men, communicating with African men. Through my scholarly work, through my writing, through my interaction, I have dealt with lots and lots of African men from different countries, different parts of the world. But I think what I'm left with is even more their ability to engage and see that African men across nationalities, across religion, across many things that divide us, have many common experiences, and many of them are under-communicated. So as I've been walking this journey, 10 years ago, an idea came into my mind that this voice that African men obviously have, and that it's like I'm being made a participant of conversations that I don't really see reflected in the general society. And I'm thinking we really need to be able to position a platform for African men. And this became the project that is called Chewbacca Men of Africa, which has been going to many African countries, and tomorrow we'll be doing it for the first time in Botswana. So this journey is really about decolonizing what masculinities have become. I see and I experience that many of us as African men have gotten stuck in a very problematic understanding of what a man is supposed to do and be. And many of those traces us back to what happened to us during invasion. The problems with our families, the problems with identity, the problems with understanding who we are has created, for many men, a different and quite disconnected understanding of masculinity. So this is the statement that I come across with a lot of African men, saying, I need to understand who I am. And I wanted to illustrate in a brief way what some African men declare or talk about when they sit in a session of explaining themselves. I want to explain this through a synthesis of stories that I'm going to present to you through the character of Afuraka. So Afuraka is a young African man. He grows up in a village. He's a herd boy. And he is expected to go out in the field, work with other boys, and look after cattle. Now, his experience is that as a young boy, he goes out and is being taken advantage of by the bigger boys who beat him up, who do things to him that obviously is painful and degrading. He then decides he doesn't want to be out in the field. So he makes up a lot of excuses. He has headache, he has stomach ache, so that he can stay closer to the compound. His father is devastated. What kind of boy is this? This boy is supposed to be out in the field, and now he's scared, now he doesn't want to go. And the father started to torment him, call him names, say he's a sissy, say he's a girl, to the point that even one day he takes a picture of Afuraka and put a dress on him and say, look at my stupid little girl. I thought I had a boy, but look at this. And he puts the picture on the wall, and it etches itself into Afuraka's memory as the definition of what he can never become, a man. So African men know your power. Power is a very problematic experience for many African people. And in the context of African men, the aftermath of having been invaded, the aftermath of white supremacy as a power, the aftermath of having been marginalized completely to the side, has an effect where many African men struggle to understand where to position their power. There is never any excuse for rape. But if we want to understand what rape is about, if we want to resolve it, these are some of the questions we need to ask. What has happened to the experience of power? Because the experience of power we have is to invade, is to take, is to own, is to define. And that's a very problematic power constellation when you take it into a relationship, into interacting with somebody that you are supposed to treat as a royal partner. So Afuraka grows. At one point, as a teenager, he's invited to a party. And he has now experienced that he's interested in girls, but he doesn't know how to approach them. And he finds that other boys are talking very roughly about what they do to girls, how they grab them, how they take them. And he doesn't have any intention of doing that to women, so he doesn't know. Maybe this is because of what my father said. I'm a girl, I'm a weak person, I cannot do this. So he's at this party, he hears some commotion in one room, and one young man comes out and grabs him and says, come here, now you're going to show that you're a man. And he realizes that he is drawn into a situation where a young girl is being raped by several young men. And she's lying there. In his mind, he wants to flee, he wants to escape, but the need for him to show and prove and demonstrate that he is, in fact, an African man takes over. And in that moment, he engages himself in something that he would never have believed he could do, understanding that he's actually contributing to the soul murder of a young lady. African men know your culture. Culture becomes a very difficult place to go to when you see that African culture has been ridiculed, has been downgraded, has been associated with barbarism and things that don't really work. At best, African culture appears to be cute and colorful. That's not a place an African strong man wants to go. So a lot of African men become removed from their cultural identity, and it has an effect on how they then need to draw cultural tools to raise these African men within themselves. Afuraka gets a scholarship. He moves to a town, and he's accepted into a good education, which leads to a good job, which leads to good money, which is the dream of every African parent to be able to earn. So he is now at the point where he's actually seemed to be a successful man, but within himself, he cannot connect. Everything that he has done seems like he has had to check his Africanness at the door and not bring it into the place of operation. So he strives to be more Eurocentric. He strives to speak good English. He strives to prove to the world that he's not a barbaric, backward African. He's a modern, Eurocentric, westernized African man. And this becomes quite problematic. He goes further. He meets a woman, and a great woman, and the woman agrees that she likes him. They get married. They have children. Now he's even elevated to another level that many African men envy and many African men look to, that this is the greatness of success. But because of the pain and the brokenness within Afuraka, he finds it difficult to be next to a woman who always is interested in how he really feels, what his opinion is over time. And he finds himself wanting not to be so much at home. So he spends time at the bar, he spends time with other women, and he becomes a man who's unfaithful. The African family is supposed to be a place of strength. We say that African culture is built on the African family. But what happens when the African family is so affected by its history and its lack of cultural strength that it reproduces some of the oppressive effects that we have endured for centuries on this continent? Afuraka is now at the point where he's no longer expecting to be a strong man. He falls into a deep hole within his mind and his soul, and he takes to drinking. He consoles himself for all the things that he feels he's not. He abuses himself for the shame that he has of what he has not accomplished, and he slowly dies within. Now Afuraka has changed. Afuraka has been able to understand more of his history, understand more of what is expected of him as an African man, move to a stronger place. That does not mean the problems disappear. It does not mean that life is necessarily easy, but he approaches it from a completely different point of view because he has developed a sense of self, a sense of rootedness, a sense of anchoredness. So when he moves with a different sense of power, and when he's confronted with issues, he doesn't just react with fear or the need to dominate. He can humble, he can take a step back, reflect, and find a solution. This, to me, is a practical interpretation of what Steve Biko explained as black consciousness. The ability to rally around the center of our oppression, which is the color of our skin, and at the same time also operate as a group to cut the shackles that have represented the oppression that we have endured. I no longer move slowly in this world. I refuse to be accustomed to aspiring no longer to appear. This is a call for African men who no longer should just be marked by being men who obey. very problematic messages and pressure points. Men who violate because the voice inside is so full of rage. And men who shut down because they don't know how to develop a language to express what is happening within. What we call for African men to become are men who rise, men who stand up with confidence, men who rebel. And this is an important point to mention, because when you stand up as an African man, the world around you will see it as a declaration of war. We don't expect that African men should be honorable, responsible, and strong in a balanced way. We have gotten so far that we don't expect a lot from African men. And as African men, we know it, and it kills us. We need African men who can relate, because the African man is nobody without being able to relate to African women, to African children, to the African community. Your identity will never be whole just because you have a success in your own corner. African culture roots you because you are part of a bigger whole. As I'm standing here, I raise my fist not just as a symbol of struggle and rage, but also in confident belief and faith in what this world will become when black men know themselves. Round of applause.